Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. Well, last week I finally got to watch the movie Wind River. Now, I highly recommend this film. This is a movie that I was anticipating. I had some expectations about. I had a few ideas in my head after watching the trailer about what sort of movie I thought it was. I thought it looked interesting. I hoped it would be good. But I had a sort of pretty sure idea about what sort of movie, the sort of box, if you like, that I thought it would fit into. But my expectations were completely blown away. It was different than what I thought. There was a lot more depth in this film. And there was a lot more profound stuff in this movie than I was expecting. And this movie was all around a lot better than what I thought it was going to be. And I highly recommend it. This is a movie that I think is one of the top movies that's been released in the last 12 months. And unfortunately, it's also one of the films that really hasn't had as much press as a lot of the other movies that have been released that are far inferior to this one. If you haven't already seen the film, this review is going to contain some mild spoilers. There's nothing too explicit I'm going to spoil for you around the story, but there will be some mild spoilers. So if you haven't seen it and you don't want anything at all to even be remotely hinted at, then shut this video off, go away and watch the film and come back. If you've seen the film, then enjoy the discussion and watch away. Basically, as I said, this is one of the best films that's been released in the last 12 months or so. I highly recommend it. If you haven't seen it, you need to get yourself a copy and watch it ASAP. Now, the acting in this movie is really, really good. Now, Jeremy Renner, I knew he was already a good actor, so I'm not one of those reviewers who's going to sit here today and say, oh, wow, I didn't know that Jeremy Renner could act this good. I've seen him in other roles where he brings his acting chops, and in this movie, he brings his A game. He's really, really good in this. He owns the character, he makes it believable, he draws you into the character. You really, as an audience, you go on the journey with him and you really are invested in him and you care about him. And most importantly of all of his motivations and everything about him, it's pretty simple and straightforward, but it all makes sense. And it makes for some really, really good storytelling. Elizabeth Olsen did surprise me a little bit. She's the other main character in this and she acts really, really well. Now, the difference between her in this film and, say, something like The Avengers, to me, it's like night and day. In this movie, she really shows that she has got this acting depth that is really being woefully underutilized by Hollywood at the moment. And I think that she's definitely got a bigger calling going forward. And I hope that she starts landing some bigger, deeper, and more profound movie roles to start showing just what she's capable of, because she's really, really good in this film. Effectively, this movie, and maybe this is why I liked it so much, this movie is a Western, and it is a very, very good Western. You have the barren frontier wilderness, the winter of Wyoming. You have the good local sheriff who is doing his best to try and keep law and order in a pretty dysfunctional sort of frontier town, but he's really holding on by his fingernails. You have the jaded gunslinger who has experienced great suffering and difficulty in his life, and he's sort of distanced himself from the town. He's sort of pulled away. He's the typical sort of Western gunslinger who would live on the outskirts and keep to himself. But there's still a deep sense of justice in his heart. He knows right from wrong. He hasn't lost the plot and become a lunatic. And when the time comes for him to be called on, he really does step up to the plate and is very much motivated by that virtuous sense of justice and right and wrong, and the fact that people who perpetrate evil should not be allowed to get away with it. You have the lawman from out of town who comes in to catch the outlaw, and she's a bit out of her depth, but at the same time she's a pretty competent lawman, and in her job she executes her role well, but she has to get used to the territory first. But she's absolutely committed, again, to the sense of right and wrong and the sense of justice. For her, what matters is that the innocent are avenged, and that those who have done wrong are brought to justice, and that the families in particular are given the respect of the law and the commitment of the law and the officers of the law that they rightly deserve, having also been the victims of a heinous crime. You have a band of outlaws, and you have the gunfight at the OK Corral, which, by the way, is just, I think, one of the best gunfights I've ever seen put into film, certainly in recent time. It's an interesting film that in many ways reminded me a little bit of Heat. I don't know how much of an influence Michael Mann was here in this film, but definitely, there's definitely, I think, a bit of a Michael Mann influence about some of the stuff, and that gunfight in particular, and the way in which it all plays out. This is a really, really great film. You've got great acting. You've got great storytelling. You've got a film that's beautifully shot in a beautiful barren sort of winter location, and in actual fact, the environment, the land, the environment, and the weather and everything else that's part of it, the climate is very much another character, another actor in this film. The weather is very much an actor in the way in which the main plot unfolds and the crime itself that they're investigating, but it also becomes an actor in other ways as well in which the story unfolds. The weather actually has an influence on shaping how the story can or can't progress, and it's used excellently. It really is used well as another player in this movie. There's not a fairy tale ending here, and I like that as well. It's not stark and bleak. It's not a dark ending like, say, for example, Frank Darabont's The Mist. It's not at that level of darkness, but it's not a nice, neat Hollywood wrap a bow on it and big smiley faces happy ending either. They don't ride off into the sunset. There is still a sense of reality and groundedness to this film, and to the reality of human suffering and grief. That's very much one of the big themes here, and also the question of justice. This is not a simplistic movie, and as I said, I was surprised. It was deeper than I was expecting, and it actually touches on some really profound issues. And this is another thing that I really appreciated about this film, and I think this is something that people who have a social conscience and who want to use their art, particularly the cinematic arts, to touch on important social issues, they should go and watch this movie, because it is a really powerful object lesson in how to do that well. They touch on this issue of the plight of the American Indians, particularly those living in these communities where there are great difficulties and impoverishment and drugs and alcohol and crime and other issues. Now, I have an understanding about this issue because I've read previously quite a bit about those Indigenous communities and the issues that are impacting them. But this film, particularly for those who perhaps might not have any insight at all into them, this is a really powerful way of touching and alerting people and drawing their attention to these issues. And what's so good about it is it doesn't preach at you. It's not simplistic. It's not like white man bad, Indian man good, white man oppressor, Indian man oppressed. There is a lot more complexity and nuance here. There's virtue and vice on both sides of this, and it doesn't try to play this absurd, simplistic SJW preaching game at you. It doesn't propagandize. This film never gets into preaching propaganda, but it does draw your attention, and I think in a very real kind of way too. And there's even some funny little moments in the film that I won't ruin them for you, but they really do around some of these sorts of issues. You can't help but be drawn into the plight of these people. And you can't help but, it's the sort of film where you want to know more. And I think that's a really good thing. It's a great example of someone using the cinematic arts with a social conscience to touch on a social issue, but they don't sacrifice storytelling. They don't sit there and engage in very cheap and unintelligent preaching. It actually does it in a way that's more likely to draw people into those issues, in a way that's nuanced and has depth. There are a couple of criticisms I have of the film. There's one moment of non-linear storytelling, and it's quite a fundamental moment. It's where they reveal what's actually happened, the crime that they're investigating, because it is very much a mystery that's unfolding. And then they get to the final reveal, and they have a flashback to what actually happened. The placement of that flashback, it's non-linear. They place it in the story in a particular spot where I was a little bit surprised by. I felt that perhaps they could have put it somewhere else in the film, but just where it was just felt a little bit abrupt. And I think I know why they did it. I think they did it to perhaps try and justify some of the events that followed after that when they go back into the main story. But I think they still could have moved it somewhere else, and I suspect closer towards the ending of the film. But it's others might not have an issue with it, but for me it just felt a little bit abrupt and a little bit odd, and it sort of pulled you out of the story in a strange way. Also, since it was very sort of clear what was going on at that particular point in the story leading up to when they do the flashback, it was kind of clear that we were moving towards a crescendo of sorts, and that those who were investigating the crime were in the right place. The other thing I'd say is that it just felt a little bit light on some of the storytelling. I think it would have been just that little bit more interesting to find out a little bit more about that American Indian community in Wyoming where this film takes place, and just sort of perhaps delve into that a little bit more. It sort of felt like only one or two characters and locations, and you got the gist of it, but it would have been good, I think, just to give a bit more of a sense of of what that community was really all about. Almost like, and I think it would have really aided this whole thing of Elizabeth Olsen's character, who really is a fish out of water, but she sort of very quickly becomes an accepted part of this posse of lawmen who are hunting the bad guys, and also, I guess, an accepted part of the community. But it would be good to perhaps have expanded that a little bit more, and if there had been a little bit more of her interacting with the community beyond what we just saw, then I think it would have given that sense of the difference here that she was dealing with, and really why she was such a fish out of water and why she needed to adjust. And then also it would have made her adjustment, I think it would have really aided her character, because it would have really shown that she was a compassionate person who was intelligent and capable as a law officer. She was capable of going into this difficult and very different environment and actually connecting with people and getting on with her job. And I think it would have just aided that whole side of her character development, and it would have, I think, strengthened the storytelling a little bit more. But they are minor criticisms, because this is a great film. I plan to add this movie to my collection. Like I said, it's one of the best films that's been released in the last 12 months or so. I highly recommend it. If you haven't seen it, you should definitely watch Wind River. If you have seen it, then I'd love to know your views. Please let me know in the comments section below. Did you like it? Did you dislike it? Do you agree? Do you disagree with anything I've said here? Thanks for watching. If you like the content that I'm creating, then please support me on Patreon. There's a link in the description below and a link on screen now. See you next time on Left Foot Media.